Chapter 16. She was to hang in the night, no witnesses to her death, no herald. The end of a woman whose deeds of mischief and mayhem were to come to a silent, forgetful end. Oubliette, the French called it, a hole in the ground where prisoners were cast, and abandoned. No time to send her east, to the death camps. The woman had an uncanny way of escaping, or getting lost, or causing disorder. This Bordeaux is decidedly a broken bar earthy, Prum considered, as he looked at the label. Betteress should be a fuller flavor. He blinked at the straw-colored liquid in the candlelight. 88,888,888. The atmosphere within the dormitory had reached a state of terminal fullness, a particular moment suspended between other moments, the eye of a hurricane, where all of the air has been removed, leaving a dry, metallic vacuum in the form of the chapel radio, where Reed, Collins and Howe had placed all their faith. And Milo fulfilled their prayers, transmitted through that fragile, glowing collection of stolen valves and copper wire. A descent upon the castle was being enacted and, as such, all officers should be alerted that, whatever danger may come about from their impending action, help was coming. Might was inching inexorably towards them. A plan was made, the plan of plans. 88,888,888. The raid did not begin with shouts but with the methodical drumbeat of violence. In the darkness of the corridor, the British officers moved with the predatory economy, having silently taken out the guards who had been stationed outside their door with the false hail of sickness, for sickness meant pestilence, and that could not be allowed to spread. And silent attacks perfected in regiment commando units, a heavy, lead-weighted stick brought down behind a sentry's ear, the heavy thud of bodies hitting stone, and the orderly drag of a corpse into shadow. At this, Dick Howe and Mike Sinclair led the way, their faces blackened with soot and cork from spent matches, moving in a low crouching gait that reduced their silhouettes against the flickering gaslight. There was no wasted movement. Bate Reed followed, checking corners with a .08 pistol liberated from one of the guards held in a steady, two-handed grip, his eyes darting with the supervigilance of a man who was experiencing his two-dimensional maps of the castle firsthand. Down the stairs and then doubled back into the stairwell for the French officers' quarters, Pat led the 8 of them through the laundry and out of the window into the German courtyard with the precision of a man who knew Colditz in his soul. Behind him, Collins, Howe and Goldfinch, Bob Sanders, Wright, Davis, Ellis and Mike Sinclair. And, last, Major David Sterling, who outranked them all. Jack Goldfinch and Charles Collins moved to the cell door with the grim efficiency of sappers. No time wasted with keys. Goldfinch pressed a strip of plastic explosive smuggled in the linings of Red Cross parcels into the door's iron hinges with the steady hands of a surgeon. The door did not so much open as atomize. There was a sharp, localized crumpling noise accompanying a brief fan of orange flame that seared the oxygen from the air, and then the heavy oak disintegrated into a cloud of drifting, grey wisps. Through this swirling curtain, the escape committee stepped with a grim agility. Bob Sanders was the last to enter, holding the MP40 taken from the escape committee's cache of stolen weapons horizontally to the threshold. He stood in the doorway, his eyes traveling from the wreckage of the lock to the 2 figures on the floor, both German guards, both quite dead. His expression was one of profound, weary distaste as he considered for whom they were putting in such effort. "The radio has gone dead," Collins, Sanders said, his voice possessing a dry, clipped quality, then glanced at Reed. "If your rescue is out there, they're remarkably quiet about it." He would not look at the figure, sitting on the camp bed opposite the door, blinking at them. Instead Saunders fixed a scathing look on the man he knew was in love with him. Sterling stood up, his movements heavy and graceless. He did not offer Josephine a hand, and she did not look for one. Instead, he took in the woman he had bruised and bedded with equal belligerence. She looked beautiful. Prum had had the twisted idea that she should look her best for her hanging, and had offered chicken, venison, rather than turnips and bread made out of wood shavings and newspaper. But first he indulged a sick idea to call for a tin bath of hot water and watch her bathe, then providing a dress of pale blue georgette silk for her to wear. Though it was a little long for her, it fitted well, and Josephine waited for the lingering captain to leave before contemplating how to leave this windowless dungeon. But she wasn't impossibly perfect. The rope burn on her neck and bruises to her face and neck told a story of her resistance having been met with force. She gave Sterling a look of detestation. Milo must have been taken by the Gestapo, Sinclair interrupted, his face the color of ashen wood. For the expected cacophony of rescue was replaced by a far more chilling sound, boots on stone. They turned and retreated and, as they did so, an explosion made them start. The resistance, Howe exclaimed. Listen, let's take. I'll bring her, Sterling told them. And we will prepare the French, check and polish, Pat Reed continued, the plan hitting the next gear. Mike Sinclair laughed. What with Bruce's thwarted escape attempt, being wrapped up in an outgoing Red Cross parcel, had tickled his dark, dry-humored wit. Novel, he commented. Reed, document this. The first time in history men are breaking into Colditz. Go. Sterling insisted, looking back through the broken door, as boots clattered along stone. Josephine? Reed asked, doubtfully. She nodded, as Sterling gestured to the laundry vent. They were to go out, and up. They'll come, she assured him, with more confidence in her voice than she felt. Collins gave her a long last look before the officers broke back out, caging the castle for signs of offensives from incomers. They were all to be ready. As Sterling squeezed his large frame into the claustrophobic chute of the laundry vent, the darkness was absolute. It smelled of washing lye and damp soot, and the metallic sharpness of torn skin, blood exposed to air. Around them, the castle groaned under the weight of a manufactured chaos. The rhythmic thudding of improvised explosives and the guttural roar of prisoners turned insurgents echoed through the ventilation shafts. Hurry up! He snapped back to Josephine, as he scrambled towards the vent back to the laundry. Behind her, Josephine Main stopped, and exhaled, exasperatedly. Slow down, she retorted. You keep bleeding all over the place. And it was true. Sterling had scraped his arms and hands on the razor-sharp granite-like rocks, stone on which the medieval castle was built, having been used as facing for the tunnel vent. Sterling moved another foot forward, hearing her scramble to catch up. The vent grate, however, buckled and screamed, falling inward with a muffled clang. Sterling spilled out like a shadow detached from the wall, his face a mask of soot and sweat. For a heartbeat, there was only the silence of the laundry, mundane clothing hanging by pegs on the crude washing line which broke as he fell, tangling him. Josephine, by contrast, lowered herself down over the copper, and scrambled down next to him. Sterling looked at her, expecting her usual vitriolic response, but instead, she helped him out of the washing. Sterling, she managed, as she watched him pull at the locked door. We got in back that way, he informed Josephine, pointing to the wall that the concealed passageway led to. The storm of boots that way, however, told them it would be a risky traverse. I know, he said, the words heavy as lead. Eve, Moosey, everything. I'm taking you out of here. He moved toward the heavy oak door, his hands working the lock with a desperate, frantic dexterity he hadn't felt since the raids on City, in those heady days of the formation, with Dudley Clark as midwife. We'll have to try it our broken bar that way, or the other. Do you think the resistance will come? Sterling asked, idly. Josephine stared at him, frowning. You were there, when we heard the transmission, you solved the frequency from the coded message. Isa broken bar. The heavy iron bolt on the outside of the door slammed back with a finality that vibrated through the floorboards. Their failure to act swiftly enough had them backed into a corner. A small, barred viewing slit snapped open. Commandant Prem's eyes appeared, crinkled with a terrible, amused satisfaction, the light from the window illuminating Sterling standing over the woman he had made sparkle before her magnificently terrible death. 4 guards apiece grabbed Sterling and Josephine, throwing them down the corridor. They were 100 yards from the solitary cell. Solitary was not what it was to become, for both were thrust inside. The Phantom Major in a stone trap. Prem's voice drifted through the iron, oily and calm. You chose a sentimental moment for your suicide, Major. I had intended to hang the girl at dawn to restore order, but the guest list has expanded. It seems only fitting that the man who broke her spirit should be the one to watch her swing before he joins her. Sterling lunged at the door, his shoulder colliding with the reinforced wood, but it was like hitting the side of a mountain. Save your strength, Major, Prom continued before the click of his heels receded down the stone hallway. The sun rises in 4 hours. I am told the view of the valley from the gallows is quite breathtaking in the early light. Sterling turned back to the room. The rescue had collapsed into a shared grave. Josephine was watching him now, not with the contempt he had craved, but with a hollow, taunting pity that cut deeper than any blade. They will come, Josephine told him, as she got back to her feet. The stone had scorched along her leg, the beautiful dress beginning to follow her last set of clothes. You're a fool, Sterling scolded, leaning his head back against the cold stone. You came back for a ghost, Josephine insisted, as distant gunfire echoed far away. The resistance plan has been in place for several weeks, months, even. Though Reed was captured, he had made contact with Milo, whoever they were. She lowered her voice. To strike at Colditz would have put a hole in the Reich, directly beside Czechoslovakia, right beside Switzerland. Since when were you the strategist? Sterling growled, hauling himself up and eyeing the door. Hope overcame the defeat he had already encountered with that exit over the months he had been there. Could they get out now? They must. He slammed his hand against the oak. You think we can escape? Josephine asked him, her voice dripping with contempt. I spent months with a key coming in and going out of here. Sterling turned to her as he inspected the masonry. Give up if you like. I'm waiting for Milo, whoever that is, but I've not given up yet. 4 hours is a long time. Josephine stared at him, and then looked across to the camp bed. Is it too late to ask Prom for 2 cells? 88,888,888. He was a man built for wide open spaces. Now he was Archibald David Sterling, reduced to a few square feet of damp floor. He sat down on the camp bed, the unmistakable staleness still in the bedding. You look pathetic, Josephine said, her voice sharp as a scalpel on his mind. She hadn't moved from her corner, her back pressed against the dank masonry. The great SAS commander, caught in a laundry chute. Did you think your hand would magically turn the locks? Sterling's jaw tightened, the muscle leaping in his cheek. I didn't come for your forgiveness, Josephine. I came because I don't like being wrong, and I was wrong about you. You were more than wrong. You were a beast. She stepped into the pale light, looking imperfectly lovely. You used me to vent your own failures. You took everything I had left, my dignity, my body, and called it interrogation. And you let me, he shot back. His voice low, vibrating. He stood up, closing the distance between them until he could smell the salt of her skin and the antiseptic stench of the prison soap. You wore that martyrdom like a suit of armor. You wanted me to hate you because it was easier than admitting you'd lost control of your own network. They stood inches apart, a volatile mixture of resentment and a magnetic, agonizing pull they both refused to name. He hated her for being the mirror of himself, of his arrogance, of his refusal to ever back down, of his hot-headedness and lack of forward planning. And now, they were going to die together. I hate you, she whispered, her eyes burning with a sudden, fierce moisture. I gathered, Sterling growled. I could still ask for the separate cell, he went on, his tone changing to a softness she had never heard him convey before. No, Josephine replied, with equal humility, if I am to die, I would prefer that in my final hours I am with someone. There was no bitterness, no retort, like, even you and Sterling did not offer a caustic reply. Instead they sat by one another in the semi-darkness. I hope you're happy now, Josephine accused. That, against all reason and evidence before you, you were still too cavalier to let sense and reason avail you. The air in the cell was thick with the iron stench of blood and the suffocating chill of the Saxony night. David stood by the iron door, his chest heaving, his knuckles raw. He looked at Josephine, who sat on the edge of the camp bed. You're a failure, David, she added, the words cutting deeper than any SS interrogation. "You were the great Phantom Major, undone by a scent of jasmine and a radio link. I warned you about Ivia Broken Bar, I told you about Natzweiler or Broken Bar, the camps. But you were too busy playing hero. And you'd prefer me to, what? Do what? Henry Druce was 10 times the man you were. He was decent, he was humble. Is that why you stayed in the muck with him? Because Henry has the decency I lack? Because he's the gallant soldier while I'm just the fool who gave you to the butchers?" Josephine stood up, her eyes flashing with a terrifying main intensity. "Henry Druce was a man who knew the value of a secret. He didn't trade my life for a moment of lust in an Algerian tent. He fought for me. Here Broken Bar gave his life for mine." She eyed him, furiously. "What have you ever done, other than dream?" "I took that strap to you," Sterling roared, crossing the distance between them in 2 strides. He grabbed her arms, his grip bruising. "I hit you so they wouldn't kill you." He let her go as quickly, and strode back, shoulders bent, habbed to mouth. "I hate that you were right about Eve. I hate that you played me better than the Abe wherever could. But don't you dare look at me and think of Druce." He saw the flicker of something in her eyes, defiance, yes, but something else. "Anita Broken Bar, a hunger." She was Paddy's blood, something Sterling still could not get his mind to account, and the trauma of the day had stripped away the Joyce family veneer. She looked at him, battered and desperate, and saw the only man who could match her darkness. "Did you really stay at Gear House?" he asked, after a time. In the gloom, Josephine nodded. "The panel," he continued, "was because my brother had just come back from school, rugger captain. I took the ball he had been presented with, and threw it down the passageway. I then ran, thinking I could overtake it, and barreled headfirst into the wood. Had a lump on my head for weeks." "Knowing you, I believe it," Josephine replied, grimly. "When you're out of here, and you get home, you can see it all again." Sterling turned his head to her. "You really think the resistance will come, don't you?" "Or, what else is there?" Josephine asked. And then she cried, crunching up her knees, and sobbed into them. "Yeah, Broken Bar promised Bill a Broken Bar," she added, between the racking emotion. Sterling got up and moved near to her, and, at this, she threw her arms around him, sobbing into his shoulder. He moved his arms slowly around her, feeling the warmth of her body through her clothing. Once the sobs ebbed away, Sterling put his lips to her ear, about to whisper something. But, at the warmth of her ear, the words evaporated, and instead, he kissed her ear, and then her face, and then her lips. Josephine kissed him back, her response hungry, her hands frantic over his body. Sterling grabbed her then, not with the calculated coldness of the cell before, but with a desperate, starving hunger. It was an admission of a debt that could never be settled in coin or blood. His mouth crashed again against Josephine's, a collision, not a kiss. She met him with equal violence, her fingers clawing at the rough wool of his tunic, dragging him into her space as if trying to tear out of his lungs. They fell back onto the narrow, freezing camp bed, the iron frame groaning under the weight of their combined desperation. It was a frantic, wordless argument. There was no tenderness in the way his hands found her, only a crushing need to reclaim the woman he had tried to break. She arched against him, her breath hitching in broken sobs of rage and desire, her teeth grazing his shoulder as she sought some kind of anchor in the storm. In the shadows of the cold its walls, with the shadow of the noose looming just hours away, the act was a frantic rebellion against the silence of the grave. It was physical. Every touch was an apology he couldn't speak, and every gasp from her was a reluctant surrender to a man she should have wished dead. For those fleeting moments, the war, the betrayal of Eve Mansour, and the impending dawn didn't exist. There was only the heat of their skin against the biting cold of the stone. His hands slid beneath the coarse silk of her dress until both of her large breasts were liberated, the heat of his palms searing her chilled skin. He held one in each hand, his thumbs circling her nipples with a heavy, rolling pressure that sent jolts of electricity straight to her core. Josephine let out a broken breath, her head falling back as his mouth followed the path of his hands, tasting the salt of his skin and the dust of the cell as she leaned forward and found his mouth. Sterling lowered her to the camp bed, his body a furnace against her. When he unbuttoned himself, he emerged truly massive and rigid, heavy and vein-mapped, which made Josephine's breath catch again at the memory his cock revived in her mind. He was intimidatingly thick, a solid weight of muscle that seemed far too large for the cramped confines of the cell, or for her. "Prove you're still a woman and not just a collection of lies," he commanded, his voice thick with a love he couldn't yet name. She took him with a suffocating hunger, her lips stretching to accommodate the broad, velvet head of him before she sank deep. The sheer, arrogant girth of him filled her throat, the heavy weight of his shaft pressing against her tongue, making her eyes water. She didn't recoil. She worked him with a frantic intensity, her hands digging into his muscular thighs. Sterling let out a low, guttural growl, his fingers tangling in her hair, anchoring her as the pleasure became a physical weight, a thick, throbbing tension that threatened to snap his resolve. Pre-cum wetted her lips. He hauled her up, parting her legs with his knees. He used his tongue with a blunt, muscular precision, lashing her swollen clitoris with a relentless rhythm. He watched the way her hips bucked, the way her internal muscles flickered with anticipation, and he drank her in until she was thrashing. When she reached the precipice, he flipped her over onto her hands and knees. He braced his hands on her hips, his fingers bruising the delicate skin, and drove home in one violent, bottomless lunge. The entry was a magnificent, staggering intrusion. He was so massive that he seemed to displace everything inside her, his thick girth stretching her raw walls to their absolute limit. The sensation was an overwhelming, blunt forcefulness that bottomed out hard at the top of her cunt, making her gasp a lungful of dust-choked air. He set a savage, piston-like pace, each thrust a heavy, wet thud. Inside her, he felt the velvet-tight grip of her walls pulsing and struggling to contain his sheer volume, a rhythmic clenching that felt like she was trying to pull his very soul into her. "Is this real enough?" Sterling hissed into her ear, his chest slamming against her back. "More," she choked out. She met every lunge with a defiant tilt of her pelvis, her body aching with the magnificent, heavy stretch of him. She felt every inch of his length sliding against her internal nerves, a friction so intense it felt like fire. A shell hit the tower as Sterling reached his breaking point. He drove deep, burying himself to the hilt, and ruptured inside her. The sensation was seismic. Josephine felt the hot, rhythmic pulsing of his ejaculation as it flooded her, a thick, searing tide that seemed to fill every corner of her being. Each throb of his release felt like a heartbeat against her cervix, a violent, back-arching surge that left him trembling. Josephine followed him over the edge, her orgasm a white-hot explosion triggered by the sheer, overwhelming volume of his seed filling her. They collapsed together in the cooling dark. Two enemies finally surrendered to the truth of their bodies. The bombardment ceased, but Sterling didn't pull out. He lingered in the cooling sweat, his hands sliding over her hips as he worked himself to hardness inside Josephine, coming again, but not before he had used his thumb to work her clit into a multiple orgasm. "Still want to claim you felt nothing?" he teased, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. Josephine's eyes snapped open, flinty and defiant. When she said nothing, Sterling chuckled. He shifted, sliding out in a coating of their liquid, before pinning her to the camp bed. Sterling slid down between her thighs, his fingers working her clitoris with a brutal, rhythmic friction. With his other hand, he seized her breast, rolling and pinching the peak until she let out an involuntary sob. "Look at me," he whispered. "Tell me again how little you feel while I'm wringing the life out of you." He didn't stop until she came again, a racking tremor that left her weeping into his shoulder. David, a broken bar that was all she could manage, as she multipled again while he ground her nipple with his teeth. Afterward, as the adrenaline ebbed and the reality of the damp cell returned, Sterling stayed tangled with her, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He stared up at the ceiling, his hand resting heavily on her waist. "Prom will be here soon," he said, his voice stripped of its bravado. Josephine leaned her head against his chest, her eyes closed, listening to the heart of the man who had ruined her and then tried to save her. "Then we have 2 hours of being alive left," She pulled his arm tighter around her, a scowl still etched on her face even as she pressed her body into his. "Don't think this changes anything, Sterling. If we survive, I'll still want to kill you." "Fair enough," Sterling murmured, his eyes fixed on the door, his mind already beginning to turn the gears of a last, impossible stand. "But if we're going to the gallows, I'm going to make sure Prum has to drag us over a mountain of his own men." 88,888,888. The revelation rippled through the underground wires with the force of a detonator cap. Milo in Leipzig had finally triggered the sleeper cells, sending a high-priority burst that bypassed the Ablaze listening posts and landed squarely in the hands of the 1st and 2nd SAS. At the forward command post, there was decoded and handed to a man whose name was already a legend of desert raids and shattered airfields, Paddy Mayne. Beside him stood Henry Druce, both men staring at the coordinates with a predatory intensity. This was the window they had been looking for, the crack in the unescapable fortress. But for Paddy Mayne, this wasn't just a strategic extraction of a high-value operative and the SAS's founder, David Sterling. It was personal. Josephine wasn't just another agent, she was the fierce, brilliant sister he had watched disappear into the shadows of the SO. He was going to rescue his little sister, and God help any German who stood between a Maine and their kin. 88,888,888. Sterling pulled his own jacket around her shoulders. It was cold now, just before dawn, and the heat of their bodies had been lost to the air. "Listen," Sterling told Josephine's dozing form. "There's shooting. There's been shooting for hours," she told him. If she were to die, she wanted to be as close to him as possible. How, now in the last, did her mind now know the truth? "The resistance is coming," Josephine told him, sleepily. A broken bar, it would hurt less. She knew a broken bar. The prisoner she had shared a cell with in London had told her that a broken bar no sense, a broken bar no feeling, a broken bar. Her head flopped back, and Josephine quickly regained her senses. For Sterling had got to his feet. "Josephine," he told her, no trace of drowsiness now in his mind. "Paddy is coming." 88,888,888. Before Josephine could respond, the world outside the solitary cell exploded. It wasn't just the diversion of the Allied officers in the courtyard anymore, nor a dozen guerrilla attacks from disparate resistance. Instead, a thunderous, rolling boom shook the very foundations of Colditz Castle, the signature calling card of SAS explosives. The gates of Colditz didn't just open, they were atomized. Paddy Mayne drove the lead jeep through the timber and stone like a vengeful god, the twin Vickers K machine guns clearing a path of fire and lead. Beside him, Henry Druce was out of the vehicle before it had even fully stopped, his Tommy gun barking a rhythmic cadence as he cleared the final SS holdouts in the courtyard, Armands and Gershaw manning a second. They reached the high-security wing in a blur of cordite and boots. Paddy Mayne had arrived, and he wasn't knocking. 88,888,888. The sirens began a frantic, panicked wail, punctuated by the rhythmic chatter of Bren guns. In the corridor outside, boots hammered against the stone as Prum's guards scrambled to respond to the sudden, violent breach of their perimeter. Sterling hauled Josephine to her feet, his arm wrapping around her waist to support her weight. He could feel the heat of her skin through her tattered clothes, his cock stirring. "We have to move," he hissed, his eyes fixed on the heavy iron door. "Paddy's blowing the gates, but we have to meet him halfway." "Can you run?" Josephine straightened her spine, the fire of the Maine bloodline flaring up in her eyes despite the exhaustion. She looked at the door, then back at Sterling. The man who had broken her dignity was trying to save her life. "I can do more than run, David," she whispered, her fingers curling into a fist. "I have a debt to settle with Prum before we leave." Because the door exploded. The stone beneath them shuddered as a heavy shell shrieked overhead, detonating in the outer bale, the outer delineation of the castle when once it served as a town border for a people under siege. The heavy oak door didn't just open, or high-velocity plastic explosive charge turned it into a cloud of splinters and shrapnel. Through the swirling limestone dust stepped Robbie Blair Paddy Mayne. He looked like a titan of old, his face a mask of soot and blood, a Thompson submachine gun held at the hip with terrifying ease. "Major." Paddy's voice was a low, subsonic rumble that vibrated in the small cell. Looking between Sterling and his sister. "I've spent 3 days slaughtering my way through Saxony to find you." He stared at Josephine. "A broken bar, Joey?" he added, when neither of them spoke. "Robbie." She pushed Sterling back and yanked his oversized wool coat over her shredded silk dress. Then, she narrowed her eyes. "You're late, Robbie," she scolded. The guards in here were not for taking the message very quickly, and the barrel of the Thompson dipped as his eyes locked onto her face. The legendary Irish rage vanished, replaced by a haunting, hollow shock. "Joey, I thought you were dead." "Natsweiler. They said you were burned. I never believed it." Sterling gave mocking bark of a laugh, his ego flaring. "Joey, is that the new play? Claiming the beast of the SAS is your kin to save your neck?" He looked at Paddy, his smirk sharpening with a lethal, possessive edge, still feeling the ghost of her heat around his cock. "She's been trying to sell me that sister rot for months, Paddy," Sterling added, conversationally, the male bravado returning. "To give her credit, she even tries to fight like an Irishman. But I've spent the last few hours teaching her exactly how a British officer takes what he wants. Twice. I've been inside her long enough to know there isn't a drop of Maine blood in that treacherous body." The air in the room froze before it became lethal. Paddy's fist connected with Sterling's jaw with the sound of a mallet hitting stone. He was on him before Sterling could recover, fingers sinking into David's throat, pinning the taller man against the damp masonry. "You speak of her like that again," Paddy hissed, a quiet, terrifying rage trembling in his voice, "and the Germans won't find enough of you to send back to Scotland." "She is my blood, you arrogant,